Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vikri, Venlil volunteer crewman of UNS Cardinal. Date, standardized human time, October 28, 2136, 11 days after the Battle of Earth. The sky was becoming grayer and grayer as dark clouds began rolling in. Nothing like the storm from a few days ago, but concerning nonetheless. Snow started drifting down around us as we continued west, entering the tree line on the other side of the stream. The humans, finally, were fully fed and brimming with energy. We planned to walk until nightfall, covering as much ground as possible. I walked next to Querek, who was walking on his own but still shivering in the wake of each passing breeze. Tenga, on the other hand, seemed to be doing much better. He still looked pale, and his throat was still making an array of concerning noises, but his energy had returned. He led the way in front of me with a much steadier pace. Grant and Reese walked behind us, chatting about an assortment of topics with an elevated mood. Grant finished whittling down a new tip on the broken spear and called out to Tenga. "How you feeling, Lieutenant?" Tenga looked over his shoulder as he trudged along. "Better, but I would kill for some painkillers right about now." He looked down at Querek and me. "What about you?" he asked. His tone was softer. Querek wrapped the blanket around himself tighter. Saliva started drooping from his mouth before he spat it out. "I can't stop shaking," he replied. "And I'm starting to get itchy." "You mean around the wound?" "Yeah, but it goes all the way up my neck. I think I can even feel it behind my ears." He spat on the ground once again. Tenga looked at me, squinting. "That normal?" I looked at Querek before looking back at him. Venlil tend to lose a lot of fur when they're sick for extended periods. That's usually how it happens. They scratch it all off because they start itching all over. If you're talking about the spitting, he's probably making some really thick saliva too. We have a gland in the back of our throats that produces saliva with immune cells mixed in. Helps disinfect open wounds. Seals them for a while too. Since we invented medicine, it hasn't served much purpose other than a minor annoyance. Querek rubbed his bandaged shoulder. "Yeah, don't really feel like soaking myself in my own drool. Weather isn't quite right for it." "So the itching is like an allergic reaction?" Reese asked from behind. "Kind of. If you consider bacteria an allergen," I answered. "I would think most creatures would be allergic to bacteria." I chuckled as I turned back to Querek. "You're going to need your fur. Can't have you scratching it all off." Reese walked closer behind us. "So, no scratching. I'll be watching." He loomed over Querek, spear in one hand. Querek looked up at him and chuckled nervously before looking back at me. I couldn't help but snicker. Reese phrased it like a threat. I was sure he didn't mean it that way, but it was a solid motivator to help Querek resist scratching. We walked in silence for a few more minutes. The air had become eerily still now that we had more trees surrounding us. The humans seemed more alert, which made me nervous. They scanned their surroundings more, often staring off in one direction for extended periods. They walked slower, and their steps became quieter. It was more unnerving that they'd all started doing it around the same time. Were they sensing something I couldn't? Suddenly, Tenga stopped. The line halted. "Something's wrong." "Glad I'm not the only one," Grant said behind us. "What's wrong?" Querek asked, scratching his neck with his paw. Reese caught him by the wrist. "No scratching." Querek sighed. "No scratching." He spat on the ground. "I don't know." Tenga replied, observing his surroundings. Evergreens dotted the landscape. The snow on the ground here was thin enough that I could see splotches of dry land around us. The terrain hosted a variety of boulders, cliffs, ledges, and many other high places. Snowflakes gently floated to the ground as the humans stood eerily still. Everything seemed the same as it had been since we started walking. Maybe that was the point. Tenga slowly walked toward a tree. It's just the little things. Things you don't pay any mind to until they start adding up. Maybe a broken branch in an odd place or the trace of a strange odor in the breeze. He ran his hand along the side of a tree and squinted curiously. Or miscolored bark on a tree. I walked up to where he was standing. The tree was a slightly lighter shade of brown on one side. It was as if it had been slowly worn down over time. Suddenly, my ears began twitching as I heard something further into the forest. I froze and looked down the hill. I hear something. What? Footsteps. Something big. How close? Close enough to see if we wait. The humans exchanged glances before they slowly knelt and looked in the same direction I was. Querek joined me behind the tree as we waited. After a few seconds, I saw something moving between the trees. It was little more than a giant silhouette to my eyes, but I was sure the humans could make out a lot more detail at this distance. Holy shit, Reese whispered dryly. His eyes widened. A grizzly, Grant added, finishing his sentence. He pulled the empty rifle from his shoulder and looked through the scope. It seems wounded. Querek leaned in closer. What are you talking about? Shh. The humans hushed him in unison. We watched as the looming mass disappeared deeper into the trees. The humans stood up and gazed in that direction for a moment. Those things should be hibernating right about now, right? Reese asked. Tenga shrugged. After all that snowfall, you'd think so. Question is, why is it awake? And why is it wounded? Is anyone going to tell us what the hell you guys are talking about? I asked. They were making me more and more nervous the more they spoke. Tenga looked over his shoulder at me as we began slowly walking. A grizzly bear. The largest land predator on this part of the planet. Typically, they sleep through the winter. This one is still up, about, and apparently injured. I'd like to find out why. We began creeping through the trees, heading toward where the bear had just come from. Everyone was on high alert. I wanted to avoid meeting the largest predator around at all costs. The humans moved with much lighter steps, which I tried to mimic to little avail. They had far more articulation in their legs than I did. The way they could pivot or roll their feet allowed them to find steady footing despite uneven terrain and lessen the sound from their steps. They had an absurd amount of motor control over their whole bodies. Without a tail, I'd have been face down in the snow trying to walk like them. After several minutes and a few prevented scratching attempts by Querek, I saw birds flying over the trees. They were circling a single area. Scavengers. We entered a clearing, and the site they circled was made clear. All around lay bloody masses of mangled flesh, covered in swarms of blackbirds, which scattered as we approached. The snow around them was dyed with blood. Behind them, the dark mouth of a cave overlooked the hill. The corpses fanned out down the slope, emanating from the dark hollow above. The area was littered with gore and feathers. I would have chalked it up to a hungry predator being disturbed by wild animals, but to my knowledge, wild animals didn't carry bags and weapons. And blackbirds had black feathers. These were Federation. Crocodile. Slaughtered. I froze as my eyes widened. I heard a horrible hacking sound behind me as Querek doubled over, on the verge of vomiting. Reese grabbed his shoulders. Hey now, you need that. Querek groaned. What the hell is this? There must be a dozen. It didn't even eat them, he said, unable to take his eyes off the scene. Tenga approached the mouth of the cave, glancing down at the bodies. He stopped just outside of it. It looks like these bastards went into this cave thinking they'd found good shelter. Instead, they found a sleeping grizzly. They woke it, it attacked, and they probably shot it to shit. Now it's awake and pissed. Probably dying. Tenga threw a broken plasma rifle to the ground. He was visibly frustrated. Grant swiveled around as he walked through the carnage. Looks like half of them tried to run. Didn't work out. It ripped them to pieces. This must have happened just hours ago. Karma is one mean bitch. Reese added. He wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. Many of the corpses were torn apart. A couple of them were missing entire limbs. Their frames were disfigured from the number of broken bones and dislocated joints. Giant claw marks cut deep into many of them, rending open their stomachs. There was no dignity in their final resting place, left in twisted resting positions and with their eyes still opened wide in horror. I'd never seen a bear, but my imagination was already running wild. Tenga began walking back down the hill. We should get out of here. It might come back. Couldn't agree more, Grant said. Reese walked into the tree line a few feet and stopped. Guys, he said, gesturing for us to come over. As we approached, I noticed the snow was disturbed. A set of footprints tracked west. They looked to be Gojid. Reese confirmed that when he picked up a quill from the snow. Grant took a closer look at the tracks. So one got away. Tenga stood next to him. They go west. We might run into them. What would we do? It's not like they'll cooperate. They could be armed, Grant pointed out. I doubt it. If they do have a weapon, it's probably in the same shape as the ones here. Broken or spent. They've been shooting at anything with forward-facing eyes and sharp teeth since they landed. Probably the herbivores too. Maybe even humans. Reese looked toward the gory scene thoughtfully. Grant sighed as he pressed at his temples with his hands. Yeah. You're probably right. We should be careful, is all. He placed his hands on his hips as he looked back to Tenga. So what's the plan? Plan doesn't change. We go west. If we run across our alien friend, we improvise. I'm far more concerned about the bear, though I doubt it'll last long if these idiots manage to actually hit the thing. I looked back at the bloody carnage behind us. It doesn't seem like it. Reese chuckled. You'd be surprised what adrenaline could do, especially in an animal that size. They probably shot it a bunch, it just didn't stop. Querek started hacking again as we were speaking. This time, it sounded like he was actually going to vomit. Sure enough, he doubled over, and a disgusting, greenish liquid gushed from his mouth onto the ground. Come on now, I told you you needed that, Reese said as he approached. As Reese rested a hand on his shoulder, Querek toppled over in the snow, almost landing in his own vomit. Reese fell to his knees next to him as the rest of us rushed over. I could hear gurgling sounds from Querek's throat. He was choking. Reese rolled him onto his side. Querek's eyes opened wide as his body tensed into a ball. Come on, buddy, breathe. Reese sat him up and began squeezing him under the arms to little effect other than allowing Querek to take a quick breath. Any ideas here, Vic? Grant asked desperately. I suppressed panic as I tried to think of a solution. It sounds like vomit mixed with his saliva, and now it's clogging his throat. Gods, the panic was now clouding my mind. I had no idea what to do. Squeezing him should be working, but if Querek couldn't do some legwork, it wouldn't come out. His throat might have been inflamed. Tenga put his canteen to Querek's lips. Here, drink. He poured that water into Querek's mouth, only for it to violently come back out moments later. His saliva was sealing his throat over. Water wasn't getting through. It might thin the film out with some time, but we were thoroughly out of that now. Grant paced for a moment with his hands behind his head, desperately trying to think of something. Tenga was helping Reese keep Querek breathing. Grant shook his head as he took Querek from the two of them and sat him up. Hold him still. Tenga and Reese exchanged nervous glances but did as the rifleman said. Grant tilted Querek's head back and sighed. Open wide. Still hacking and gurgling, Querek complied. Grant carefully reached into the Venlul's throat with his fingers. Querek struggled slightly, grabbing at the human's arm with his claws, but Grant was determined. The gurgling stopped. I watched anxiously as Grant gritted his teeth. This was dangerous, but I saw no other options. "Got it," he said as he withdrew his hand from Queric's mouth, flicking the disgusting cocktail onto the dead grass. Queric began hacking and gasping for air as he expelled the rest of the blockage onto the snow. Queric collapsed on his side, clutching at his injured shoulder. He began crying out in pain, the kind of cry that sent my instincts into overdrive. He sounded as though he were being eaten alive. Grant quickly clasped a hand over his mouth and put a finger over his lips. "Quiet. That bear is still out there." He removed his giant paw from Queric's face, and the pilot began panting heavily. "It hurts so bad," he whimpered. "Your shoulder?" I asked, ears folded on the side of my head. Queric nodded, panting out raspy whines as he held his arm tight. I placed my paws on his head. "Still hot. You probably irritated the wound when you vomited, you'll be okay," I tried to reassure him. I could tell he wasn't buying it, but he nodded anyway. I looked over at the mess Grant had flicked onto the ground. Tree nuts. All held together by a concoction of digestive fluids and slimy saliva. Those were officially off the menu from now on. "We gotta go," Tenga emphasized. Grant scooped Queric up, and we all made a break for the forest. After all that commotion, the bear definitely knew we were here. Despite my anger toward the Federation, I hoped those soldiers did manage to injure it at least. Hours passed, and Queric didn't get much better. He was back to being carried by the humans all over again. He was getting weaker. If Grant hadn't had the insane thought to simply dig out the blockage himself, he might have choked to death on his own vomit. It may not work if it were to happen again. Grant could have just as easily lodged it even deeper. We set him close to the fire as the sun finished setting and, once again, removed his bandages. It seemed I was partially right about the vomiting stressing his wounds. A few of them had opened up again and began seeping blood. However, unlike the rest of his body, the area around the wound was cool to the touch. The skin beneath was pale and shadowy in some places. I worried that his tissue might not be getting enough blood and was slowly dying. It would explain why he was still in pain. Whether this was because of an infection or Tenga's archaic solution to the bleeding was unclear. If his flesh started necrotizing, he could die. Even if not, he'd probably lose the arm. Tenga fixed his own bandages, holding the fabric in his teeth as he cut it. He looked completely fine, yet I knew a lethal virus was probably already making its way to his brain. I plopped down next to Queric, who had fallen asleep as Grant began wrapping him back up. I rubbed my ears against the side of my head. Tomorrow would be the 12th day. I doubted the Federation stragglers would be so lucky. In fact, I'd seen enough evidence to soundly make that assumption. What hurt to know was that, despite everything we did in those 12 days, I could still lose my friends even well after we made it out of here. They wouldn't be piles of blood and guts outside of a bear den, but pale corpses on a hospital bed. I fought to hold back tears as I held my ears to the side of my face. I felt the huge paw of a predator rest on my head. Tears started rolling out of my eyes. Tenga sat down next to me without a word. He just held my head to the side of his chest as he looked down at Queric. He was warm but seemed to be coming down from the fever. Even through his clothing, I could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. The strongest muscle the humans had. I took in a deep breath and sniffled. "We're gonna be all right." "Oh, so I am getting through to you." I snickered as I wiped my face. Sitting on the other side of the fire, Reese suddenly got up and took a burning branch from the flames. He walked a few meters away and held the fire high. I saw a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness between the trees. Fear started boiling in my chest. The humans stood up while I hid behind Tenga. They peered into the darkness for a few moments before Grant chuckled. Lucky, lucky, lucky.